All right, as we move into the third learning objective, applying Kantian utilitarian philosophical approaches to address issues in contemporary discrimination, specifically around issues of race, gender, and disability. This is an area, I think, of immediate value and importance. So let's talk about some of these things. All right, the first bullet point here on this slide, compensation for past wrongs. This is often referred to as the term reparations. All right, so the question is, for instance, should African Americans, the descendants of slaves or the descendants of discrimination, be compensated for those past wrongs? Now, historically, America has admitted to wrongs in the past. They have admitted to discriminating against specific groups of people. For instance, during World War II, America systematically rounded up Japanese Americans, placed them into concentration camps, and held them there for a series of years. In the early 1980s, the President Ronald Reagan admitted that the United States had made serious mistakes and had acted irrationally and had used race unfairly. In the early 90s, Congress voted to pay reparations to the descendants of the survivors and the descendants of these Japanese internment camps in the United States. And so here in this case, the United States admitted that they had done wrong. The impact of this wrong of rounding up Japanese American citizens and placing them in camps for a series of years was first the immediate loss of home and property, the immediate loss of possessions that had to be sold off or were simply given away, the loss of employment and industry. Property owners had to sell their homes. Business owners had to give up their businesses, and many of them were unable to reclaim those after they were released from these camps. And so there was an immediate financial harm done to these Japanese Americans during World War II. And it was for that reason that America admitted its wrongs and agreed to make reparations, try to pay the Japanese Americans and their survivors as a way of helping for the wrongs that it had committed. In the early 20th century, America engaged in a practice called eugenics, which was the forced sterilization of people who were who appeared to have bad genes. So people who, well, there's a variety of criteria that they would use, but let's just say that I think it was in 35 states during the 1920s, the states allowed for the forced sterilization of people who were seen to be unethical, who had no morals, or who were criminals. And more recently, states, as a way of making amends for the forced sterilization of many people, agreed to make payouts to the offspring or the descendants of those victims. And so, for instance, in North Carolina, they set aside a giant sum of money that people who were forcibly sterilized in the 1920s could receive payment for those injuries. So a question about America's past with African Americans then should pop up. Should America make amends in the form of financial payout to the descendants of slaves, to the descendants of Jim Crow laws in the South, to the descendants of discrimination in housing discrimination in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s? If we look at questions about, if we look, for instance, at what's the term? The net value by race in America today. If we simply look at people and their net value, like how much, not just how much money do they earn in their jobs, but their possessions, their homes, their cars, and their 401ks. And if we put that money all together, and if we look at what the average, and we look at this by the average by race, we will see that, according to reports I saw just a few years ago, the median net value of a white person in America is like 140,000. The net value of an African American or a Hispanic American or Mexican American is under 20,000. Now, how do we determine this huge gap between white, black, and brown? And many historians will point to the series of discrimination, the history of discrimination and racism in America as the primary determination of that net value. Right? I'm a white man. My grandmother died a few years ago. My grandmother owned property. That property was then passed along to my grandmother's children, which was then sold, and that value then was passed along to me. If my grandmother had been an African American woman during the 1940s, she would not have been permitted to buy property based, where she was living. Therefore, that money that she paid every month into her mortgage would instead have gone to the pockets of the landowner. So that money would not then have been passed along eventually to me or to my grandmother's children. And so in many ways, I financially have benefited from my grandmother's race. That may not be true for all people. And so when we consider this, is it ethical? Is it just to have policies that compensate today for those who were or are the descendants of discrimination in the past?